This photograph shows a Jewish prisoner of war in a German camp. The authorities have had time to arrange a yellow star on his uniform, which shows that the camp must be somewhat further back from the front, as the initial places of captivity were only concerned with interrogations related to battlefield intelligence. According to the Bundesarchiv, this photograph comes from August 1941 and was taken by a Herr Friedrich of the propaganda company of the armed forces. This photographer also took pictures during and after the French and Greek campaigns, as well as a number from the war against the Soviet Union. In August 1941, he was in Pashkowo. There are a number of places with this name. I presume that this is the Pashkowo, which is near Mogilev in Belarus, but of course I could be wrong. If this is correct, then this puts this camp as one of those camps which were to the east of Minsk. There are various photographs in the prisoner of war camp in the German Federal Archives, 3 of which show prisoners of war with a large yellow star on them. The name of the photographed person is not known, nor is his fate, but presumably his fate was not pleasant. In all probability, he did not survive to the end of the year, if indeed he survived to the end of that month. Jews made up around 2.1% of all Red Army soldiers, and among the officer corps this proportion reached 4.6%. This would mean at least 450,000 to 500,000 soldiers. If they fell into Nazi captivity, they couldn't hope for mercy. In the combat zone, where the main goal was to transport the mass of prisoners of war to the rear, there was usually almost no time for a detailed check. Therefore, Jewish Red Army soldiers were usually identified only in the rear areas of the army and, sometimes later, in the main camps located further to the west. The German soldiers usually couldn't tell who was Jewish and who wasn't, but in identifying them they had an ally, non-Jewish Russian POWs, who after hundreds of years of racism largely fomented by the Russian Orthodox Church, were happy to single out Jews for their captors. The Soviet-Israeli historian Aaron Schneer has documented numerous such cases in his book Captivity. This is the former prisoner of war camp at Grondy near Ostrów Mazowiecka in occupied Poland. This camp was one of the largest prisoners of war camps for Soviet prisoners of war. It was set up here as it was close to the border between the Soviet and the Nazi line of demarcation in Poland, when the two countries were allied and combined their forces to start World War II and invade Poland. At a distance of around 13 kilometers from the camp, former trenches dug as border defences by the Red Army before the 22nd of June 1941 were used for the mass murder of Soviet POWs, and probably some of those who were shot here were murdered because they were identified as being Jewish. Hitler insisted that both Jews and political commissars could be murdered upon capture. The Russian historian Pavel Markovich Polyan states that the very first such murder happened on the first day of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the 22nd of June 1941. According to his calculations, 94% of all Jewish prisoners of war from the Soviet Union who were captured perished in captivity. The main method of exterminating Jewish prisoners of war was mass shootings. There were cases where Jews were sent to special camps before ending up in death camps. On the 14th of October 1943, there was a revolt in the Nazi death camp at Sobibór, where almost all of the prisoners could have broken out had they chosen to do so. This revolt was precipitated by the arrival of Red Army prisoners of war who were selected to work on part of the camp and not for immediate death in the gas chambers. Realizing on the very same day of arrival that this was a death camp, they plotted a revolt with people already in the camp. The revolt involved killing the German and Austrian staff so that the camp guards, who were recruited from Soviet prisoners of war and called Travniki men after the place that they were trained, would not have any leadership. The plan was largely successful, and the prisoners were able to break out, and perhaps as many as 50 survived to the end of the Second World War. In 2008, I did an interview with the last of the former Soviet prisoners of war to survive, Arkady Weisspapier, and you can see it by following the below link. Let's return to this photograph. I remember the very first time I saw it. It was in the Museum of the Sargon POW camp, the one where the Great Escape took place from. Then it made a major impression on me. We know a lot about the Great Escape thanks to the fact that almost everyone survived the camp, even if the escapers didn't, and furthermore, they were treated as heroes when they returned. Not so the Soviet POWs. They were not treated as the Allied POWs were. They were starved, mistreated, and murdered with impunity. They were used for slave labour. And when they returned, a large number of them were treated as traitors for having surrendered, ignoring the fact that their surrender was caused by the politics of the Kremlin itself, which had chosen to ally itself with Nazi Germany at the beginning of the war. Despite their numbers, there is very little literature on them. Even today, when hardly any are still alive, the Russian regime in the Kremlin ignores its former soldiers. True enough, it might wheel one or two out for propaganda photographs when this suits its militaristic and imperialistic purposes, but look at the state of Soviet military cemeteries. Unlike those from other countries, they are abandoned and uncared for. Here we see the Soviet cemetery in Malbork, Poland, which sits next to a British cemetery. Just compare the two. Or perhaps the location of the mass graves at the Grande camp. Here around 80,000 Soviet POWs were buried, and the location of the graves has been completely reclaimed by the forest. Why doesn't the Kremlin today do anything to honour its dead? I hope you found this interesting. I upload every Tuesday and Friday at 2000 hours and sometimes at other times too. To know when I'm uploading or doing a live chat, then you can subscribe. That way, in theory, you should be informed about when there's a video coming. But I know there are problems with informing people on YouTube. That is why I always upload at the same times, 2000 hours Central European time. The Holocaust is my special interest in history, and so you'll find many videos here relating to this subject. Goodbye for now, and all the best from me.